Hello, Charlie TCG here, and welcome back to another Retro Thursday. Today we're looking at Worlds 2006, the time where Delta species, Pokemon of different types, were really kind of dominating the format. And with the Terra Pokemon coming out, where we're seeing Charizard and Tyranitar of different types, I feel it'd be more appropriate to kind of have a flashback to see exactly what did some of these Pokemon which had different types look in the past. So we're going to break down those sort of those sort of cards and the different archetypes that went around with it. We're also going to look at the format, what cards were legal, and of course the tournaments that happened in them. What were the best decks of this sort of era, and which cards defined this sort of meta. So let's jump right into it. So the legal sets, there were quite a few. This wasn't a whole lot of the EX era, but we had from Holon Legends all the way to Legend Maker. The introduction, of course, of Delta species, which are Pokemon of different types in the EX Delta species era. This was a really interesting time where we had Pokemon like, for example, Raichu, which were a metal Pokemon, where normally electro types resist it. So it had some really interesting, unique sort of effects in there. And there were quite a few tournaments that happened. During this time, there was, in fact, Worlds, Nationals, and Gym Challenge. Gym Challenge, I couldn't see too much about when I did research on it, but I'm guessing they were kind of like similar to like cities and League Cups that were happening around sort of the old sort of time. So it's really interesting to see there were some smaller sort of tournaments. And what exactly deck was really powerful? Well, it's this deck called LBS, which is Lugia, Blastoise, Steelix. The idea is Blastoise EX, very sort of similar to where we've seen in lots of formats as well. It's like Rain Dance. So you have flood board of energies, and you have the likes of Lugia and Steelix, high HP, huge amount of damage output, which can really flood the board and kind of get stuff going. Also really powerful archetypes here like Nidoqueen, which obviously did really well in Worlds, and some other ones which you kind of can see jump here and there. Lunarock, Eeveelutions, and Mew Manectric, which obviously performed incredibly well over in League and other sort of tournaments. So really interesting to see these sort of decks kind of prop up. And obviously we had introduction of EXs in these sort of operations, which meant there were two prize Pokemon, but they were quite a bit of slow games because they have quite a while to really set up. And 150 HP in the Blastoise is very difficult to get those big one-hit KOs. And then obviously in Nationals, looking at the rest of the whole of the rest of the Nationals, which have been recorded and so far, LBS, in fact, actually was the most dominating one. Didn't actually win US Nationals. That was done by Raichu Eggs. But we didn't see the likes of like how powerful LBS is. It's very much one of these big, strong ones where you have a Pokemon here which can very easily do 200 damage. That's a very, very tricky thing to come around with it. And a lot of other sort of decks here, but Lunarock and Lockrock were another very, very powerful archetypes going around. So if we just look at the US Nationals and sort of result, kind of paints a picture exactly how powerful were certain decks. And we look here, LBS's Lugia Blastoise Steelix deck was dominating the meta by being 40% of the top 32 results. This is an incredible good result, and we've kind of seen this a few things here and there, but seeing how dominant and present this deck is, it's quite a good understanding to see exactly what were the top decks over in this era. Dragonite sort of decks did also pretty sort of well by being 12%, and the Ray Eggs, which is a deck which performed incredibly well, and actually I believe was in back-to-backs in the national sort of things, was in fact having a 6%. Other sort of decks were really powerful, like example the Rocklock and Lunarock as well, and the Flareon Ariados, which is another very powerful archetype during this era. So what I want to break down now is exactly what was LBS. So just looking at certain decks here to kind of get a better understanding to exactly how these sort of archetypes really came around. And kind of looking in here, we see this Lugia. Lugia does this big 200 damage, which is absolutely insane, doing a huge amount of damage overall with the huge power of a Blastoise. And you have the likes of these things called Holon. Holon were these very interesting cards which let you pretty much, they were Pokemon, but you could be attached as special energies. And having a really big special energy, so with energy acceleration, was really interesting, especially in these sort of archetype. We had the likes of Holon Castform, which is the more popular one, which lets you pretty much put attach into and be two colorless energy. And then you also have Magnezone and Magnemite, which corresponds as 1 and 2 special energies. Very interesting to kind of see this sort of work out. And they were very much a big staple in these archetypes around here. Steelix is another very interesting sort of card by having 150 HP, and it can't be poisoned. And these big sort of damage, which can deal a load of damage from that, and having that extra discarding factor, which is really powerful when having the likes of these Holon cards to really kind of like set this sort of constantly being replenished. And Jirachi was very much like the Stellar Wish Jirachi, if you remember back in the day. But in fact, it does even more by making you look at the top 5 cards and choose one of them to put into your hand. Very, very powerful. Otherwise, well, Mew very similar to what we've seen in lots of other stuff, just copying the effects on both of your Pokemon, any Pokemon in play, and use that as attack, kind of like your guaranteed other sort of attacker. And the Lugia is definitely more of the closest sort of list, and this in sort of deck in this one. And those are other really good supporting ones like Rocket Asmin, which is basically N, and now obviously Iona, and Holon Mentor and Steven's Advice really helped the draw factor and synergy. Back then, Rare Candy was absolutely busted by pretty much, it wasn't a when you have to wait a turn, stuff like that, evolve, which is the normal rules. You can pretty much choose one of your basic Pokemon and play if it's a stage 1 or stage 2 and evolve it into that Pokemon. So you could get your Blastoise out turn 1, which is absolutely insane, or even a Steelix. And this Pidgeot was pretty much the incredible good draw factor in this sort of game, which allows you to choose any one card from your deck and put it into your hand. Pretty much imagine a computer search every single turn. There wasn't too much sort of changing into the list. We obviously had VS Seeker back in the day, which is really, really powerful. And here you can kind of go like, there's really not that many basic energies. The last one had quite a few. This one now has 7. The last one had 8, this one 7. Like, why is this sort of thing? Well, because you obviously have the Holon cards, so you're constantly using them again and again as these big sort of powerful archetypes, so these big one-hit KOs in the late sort of game, which is really interesting to see that we don't see Pokemon with like so many different basic type Pokemon, which can really help in this sort of matchup by doing lots of different sniping archetypes as well. So again, something really interesting to think about by having these sort of synergies around there. These big sort of hitting hard with Lugia and Steelix, and your Blastoise really help set up the board state. We're having supporting paths like Pidgeot, Jirachi, and the Holland archetypes to really kind of like gauge DMs or setup. So I thought I'd break down exactly what are these core cards, looking at them in a bit more detail. Obviously, we see here Blastoise, which is pretty much energy acceleration, but you get to put 1 damage counter on every single time, and you can do this big, obviously 80 damage with Hyper Whirlpool, and obviously you flip a coin for each head, your opponent discards an energy, which is pretty interesting. Like, you're not really going to use that. You obviously have Lugia EX, which is the big finisher, doing 200 damage, and you discard a fire, water, and lightning attached to it. Because you have a Holland thing and +1 energy attachment Blastoise, it's going to be powered up very, very easily. And if in the active spot is damaged by the KO, your opponent flips a coin. If heads, choose the energy attached to the attached Pokemon and return it to your opponent's hand. Very, very interesting. There's constantly effect going on them. They have Pokepower and Pokebody. Pokebody is pretty much like the abilities which can obviously be shut up, but Pokebody is something which is always an effect on the opponent and can never really be turned off, whereas Pokebody can be shut off for the likes of special conditions. Steelix EX obviously has a Pokebody, which means it can't be poisoned, and does 70 damage, but this big one, Mudslide, which is discard 2 fighting energy, which is pretty much you discarding your Holland Cast Form or Magnezone, you can deal 100 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon. Very, very powerful, where there was very little bench barrier, but it had a 5 retreat cost, so very, very difficult to kind of like remove it from play. And also had 2 weaknesses, which is really interesting, where with fighting type was pretty powerful, but there wasn't too many good fire type archetypes. And then the Pidgeot, like I mentioned, pretty much having a computer search, or more importantly, Starbirth only for 1 card every single one of your turn is insane. Really, really powerful, really, really strong, especially with free retreat. Incredibly strong, killing any sort of card you need to set up. Getting those Holland cards, so I really find it absolutely fascinating that this card was such a powerful archetype and really much a staple in a load of these decks. Also, really powerful cards were the likes I mentioned. Rare Candy, pretty much meaning you can get any of your raw Pokemon out as quickly as possible, which is insane. Holon Mentor, which is pretty good, which you get to discard a card from your hand. If you can't play it, obviously you can't discard. Then you search your deck for 3 basic Pokemon that have 100 HP or less. You get to find Lugia with this and loads of other your setup. So this is really good. This is kind of your think of it like Professor Elm's research, or Bridget, which obviously Bridget goes to the bench. But having these sort of really good searching archetypes like Fan Club is really, really powerful to kind of get those setup cards which you desperately need. Steven's Advice is really, really good, letting you draw a number of cards, the number of your opponent has in play. If you have more than 7 cards in play, you can't play it. So this is really good like in the late sort of game, where when you kind of burn through your hand quite a lot after a big bad Rocket's admin your opponent did, you get to draw loads of sort of cards like that. Holland's Receiver is very, very powerful, kind of getting these it's an item card which lets you to guarantee get your Holland like Mentor from the discard pile or potentially the deck, which is really, really good. Kind of like another sort of way of a VS Seeker. This is really, really powerful archetype to kind of help with this setup. And that's why I believe that LBS was such a powerful archetype, because of these 8 single cards. So I want to now talk to you about, there was some interesting mechanics that did happen around it. Delta species, which are Pokemon of different types from their original one, and they can also be dual types. If we look here at Dragonite, Dragonite here is 2 types. It is a lightning and steel type, still having an original weakness of being weak to colorless, but very interesting that it does have these two sort of dual types, meaning it can hit for two sort of weaknesses, which I absolutely adore in the Pokemon trading card game. I really love Pokemon of different types. This was really kind of when I was really understanding from buying my first Pokemon card packs. It was during the Delta Species era, which did last for quite a while, and I think it's one of the best mechanics Pokemon has really ever done. Obviously, this Dragonite was incredibly powerful, which is pretty much Dynamotor if you banter it to one of your bench Pokemon, which is really, really powerful and can do these big sort of hitting damage. And then Raichu, again, a very powerful Pokemon, but having a metal weakness. Very, very interesting that it does have a, metal type and having a fighting weakness. Very different to what we're kind of used to being seen, but does have the normal sort of weaknesses what the Dragonite and Raichu normally have. But having a hitting for different typing, it's really, really strong and very powerful archetypes. And I just find it such a fascinating idea that Pokemon did. And I'm so glad they're kind of bringing it back with Terra Pokemon. They're finally seeing like Pokemon of different archetypes, which is exactly why I think these Pokemons were absolutely incredible. Another archetype, which I've been talking a lot, is the Holon cards. They kind of range from multiple different types. They were Pokemon, they were items, they were supporter cards, they were tool cards, and even energy cards. But mainly they were there to really help with the setup or be that extra energy. If we just look at that, obviously Holon's cast form kind of being there as that additional rainbow energy, 2 rainbow energies, which is really, really powerful and exactly what you need. Whereas likes of Holon's Researcher, lets you discard a card and search your deck for a metal Pokemon or the basic Pokemon that has Delta Species in it. They kind of worked really well with the Delta Species archetype, made it a lot more easier for you not to play as many sort of special energies around there, and kind of making sure that you can really get a big setup. Holon cards are absolutely huge staples in this sort of era. Same thing with Delta Species, really powerful archetypes, which were really interesting with exactly how they would set up. So now let's look at Worlds. They happened over in California in 2006. And it was the last tournament before they really went into these division archetypes. What I mean by that, like juniors, seniors, and masters. These were in these like minus like 10 and younger, 11 to 14, and 15 plus. Really interesting that they kind of had that sort of archetype there. But I'm glad that we did change it into these more like senior, junior, and masters, kind of having those sort of defined brackets and divisions. And there was in fact a top 32 cut after playing in a day 1 tournament. Top 32 is very much exactly the way you thought. LBS, from what I've mentioned in this video, was in fact the most played archetype. With the sheer power and strength that deck has to offer, it was absolutely up there on top. There was the card Metanite, which is like that Dragonite I showed you, which teamed up with a really powerful Metagross, which could deal a load more damage, would help with setup, and this is exactly how it was really powerful. Dark Tyrant Electrode or Bomb Tar was another really powerful archetype, making sure you just knock out your Electrode, power up and use its ability to kind of power up your Dragonite and do, Tyranitar and do a huge amount of damage. Really, really interesting sort of card. And there was also another Dragon Toad, which is like a dark, like it's a Dragonite version of it. So it's really fun to see there were 2 different like Electro decks kind of working around there. I really found it's definitely a more interesting, more diverse meta, and definitely the last time where I generally think Pokemon had incredibly fun sort of names like we have Metal Knight, Bomb Tar, Manectric. Really interesting names that Pokemon did, and I found that was such a fun archetype to kind of go around, and I really like that sort of way around it. But what exactly came on top? Well, it was Mew Electric that ended up winning. LBFs didn't even make top 8. Very, very interesting. Whereas you look at it, the biggest position of LBS was in fact 13th place. So it's absolutely dominating, powerful archetype. Didn't really even get into the top sort of 10. So it's very fascinating to see that work. This was won, in fact, by Jason Galinsky with Mew Manectric. Second place was an Eeveelution deck, and then top 4 was Metanite and Nidoqueen, and then top 8 was Dark Dragonite and Electrode, another Mew Manectric, another Metanite, and a LudiCargo or Mechago or LudiCargo. Very fascinating. I absolutely adore the names in this sort of set. So without further ado, let's just break down exactly these sort of lists. So as I mentioned before, we did have this focus decks a load on Mew, which lets you copy any of your attacks you have in play as long as you have the necessary energy requirements. Another big sort of attack in this one is Manectric EX. With that huge amazing disconnect, which lets your opponent not play any trainer cards, so except supporter cards, so having an item lock is really, really strong, and discarding loads of energies with Mega Shot, dealing additional 80 damage to one of your opponent's Pokemon. This is really strong where you play loads of lightning energies and play loads of Pokemon which require only 1 or 2 special other energies, because you use the likes of multi-energy. This is basically Luminous Energy was a reprint of multi-energy, and pretty much stating that this is any sort of energy, it's a rainbow energy, but if you have another special energy attached to it, these immediately do absolutely nothing, and it's a colorless energy. So with the likes of this, your Mew, you can copy your Manectrics, do a huge amount of damage. That's a way of the discard, and having other really cool support Pokemon. Deoxys lets you pretty much do 50 damage to any of your the active Pokemon, going for absolutely everything. Regirock here does really powerful, where you get to heal some damage during your turn, and doing 60 damage. You're never really using that sort of attack, but it's a really good sort of wall Pokemon in there, kind of like sitting there and making sure you can get your setup in as well. Roserade, again, very, very powerful archetype, which lets you switch your opponent's bench Pokemon with one of their defending Pokemon. If you do, that Pokemon is now poisoned. So kind of like you want to get that stall set up whilst you're really setting up your Manectric, your Mews, and getting those big damage that way. And of course, you play the Holon's Magneton, so you can use these other sort of attacks as well, which is very, very strong. And Giraffe Freak lets your opponent not play any of their Poke Powers. Really interesting sort of deck, and playing loads of other good support archetypes in here. Scott, one of the most interesting supporters ever, where you just search your deck for supporters. We don't really see this anymore because the format was absolutely that slow. You have to play a supporter to kind of get your supporter, so you're constantly going around it. And it does play other sort of archetypes like the Battle Frontier, which each of the Pokemon's colorless evolved Pokemon, dark evolved Pokemon, and metal evolved Pokemon can't use any of their Poke Powers. We're really trying to shut off any of the dark type Pokemon that are really dominating the format in this sort of era. So really interesting sort of deck as well. And if we just look at the Eeveelutions one here, you're seeing like, oh my word, there are so many Eevee Pokemon. All of these are EXs, and guarantee if we probably have to rebuild this deck, it's going to be very expensive. It's using every single one of the Eevees here. We have the likes of Flareon EX, where once during your turn, when you play a Flareon EX to evolve your Pokemon, your opponent is now burned and doing more damage with doing 30 and 70 more extra damage. Umbreon, very, very powerful. These are kind of like the on play on the evolve sort of your opponent chooses to you get to switch, the opponent gets to switch their active Pokemon. Very, very powerful, similar to Umbreon VMAX, but kind of in reverse. Having the likes of Espeon as well, making sure they get to remove one of their highest in stage Pokemon out on play on the bench. Flareon lets you to your opponent gets to when evolve one of your Pokemon, the opponent has to shuffle his or her hand into the deck and draw 4 cards. Being a bit like Let Loose and other sort of really big powerful attacks. And Jolteon gets to put 1 damage counter on each of your opponent's Pokemon in play. Having this huge sort of range of Pokemon there is very, very strong to constantly be kind of like reusing these sort of factors and the likes of it. With the likes of Energy Pokemon Retrieval, so you get to retrieve any of your Pokemon you have in there. And obviously the likes of Surprise Time Machine, where you get to de-evolve any of your Pokemon you have in play and constantly be using any of the Eeveelutions you need. I think this is such a fascinating deck, such a different archetype with loads of different Eevees, which can deal different sort of effects per the sort of factor you need. Having the likes of Holland's Electrode as an easy way to kind of get those special energies and you out and play, and the Pidgeot to get any of the Pokemon you need. Very fascinating, very interesting archetype, and generally something which I absolutely adore. Another one here is this Nidoqueen, where Nidoqueen is very interesting by having a huge amount of HP. Not only does it have 120 HP, but it does have the Poke Power, where as long as the Nidoqueen is play, likes of Nidorine, Nidorina, and male and female have 0 retreat costs. So your Nidorina and Nidorina, whenever you have them play, they immediately have 3 retreat costs and can deal some big damage with Toxic, where the opponent is poisoned and they put 2 damage counters on, and Power Translit, which has 40 damage and does 40 more plus 10 more damage for each of your evolved Pokemon you have in play. The idea is you kind of have a load of your Nidoqueens out, you have your Pidgeots, and then you have the Houndooms, which as long as you have less Pokemon in play than your opponent can't play any trainer cards. So the idea is you want to have less Pokemon cards out in Pokemon in play and making sure the opponent can't play any trainer cards, which is a really good sort of lock factor, and having as many evolved Pokemon out in play to deal potentially an additional 50 more damage, or even 60, depending if you have a fully evolved bench. Very interesting, and I absolutely adore this sort of deck. Even does play some Delta species in there by the other Pidgeot, which as long as this Pidgeot has a Holon energy attached to it, each player's Pokemon that have Delta species into it can't use any Poke Power. This is a shot off the deck, which I'm just about to talk to you in the next slide, which is very interesting, very fascinating. I really find this deck really powerful, very interesting. Just have Warp Energy, which is very much, I believe, like a Switch sort of card. Yeah, it pretty much is a Switch. And then it has the double Rainbow Energy, which allows you to pretty much have a 2 rainbow costs if you are behind in prizes. Very fascinating, very interesting archetype. And then this one here, Metanite, which is kind of becoming my favorite archetype in this sort of set. Obviously, we talked about Dragonite, which allows you to, which is pretty much Dynamotor, but we have 2 copies of Metagross. We have a Delta species Metagross, which is the same type, which is once during your turn, you may look at the top 4 cards of your deck, choose one of them and put it into your hand, put the other 3 cards at the bottom of your deck. Not too bad, but Crush and Bone does 30 damage and you discard as many energies as you like attached to your Pokemon in play, and the 30 plus 20 more for each energy you have. So if you have a load of these Dragonites out there, you're constantly discarding as many of these cards as much as possible. Back then, metal energies didn't actually exist. They were only released as special energies. So you have to have these special energy attached here. And what's really powerful about this one is it is reduced by 10 damage, any of the damage it is done to it. So the likes of Metagross and the likes of Dragonite, they have effectively 110 HP. Very, very powerful. And yes, it does in fact stack. This is good because you can also use the other Metagross as well, which once during your turn, you may search your deck, your discard pile for a Psychic or Metal Pokemon card and energy and attach it to one of your Pokemon. Pretty much having the Psychic attack, which you can immediately reuse Metagross's attack to do 70 damage, and if Metagross and if any Pokemon have a different amount of energy attached to it, this base is 40 instead of 70. Not too bad, but very interesting as well. And I think it's absolutely fascinating by having the likes of Metang, which is the free retreat if it's got no energy attached to it, and Belgium as well, which you pretty much get to flip a coin if you search your deck for a metal basic Pokemon and put it onto your bench. I absolutely find this deck is super, super fascinating, super incredible, and really, really strong. Having likes of Celio's Network, which, if you don't know, is a very, very popular PokeTuber, but also kind of got its name from here. We had to search your deck for a basic Pokemon or evolved Pokemon, show it to your opponent, and put it in your hand. I absolutely adore this deck. It's super fascinating, and generally something which I'm so excited, which is making me even want to build this archetype. I don't think I'm financially ready to build this archetype at all, but I think it's one of these really fascinating archetypes which I can't wait to explore. Other ones as well here is this Dragonite with Electrode. This is a very fascinating, very interesting sort of archetype here, because you have the likes of Dragonite and Dark Dolphins. You like, you may move your Darkness energy attached to your Pokemon to another one of your Pokemon in play. So pretty much having a way to constantly be removing all your energy set in there. And you have the likes of your Dark Electrode, which if Dark Electrode has no energy attached to it, you may switch it with one of your a dark or dark metal energy and attach it to Electrode, shuffle your deck afterwards. So pretty much making sure you can kind of energy accelerate here constantly by having that. But once your turn, if you have 2 of these out in play, you get to attach more darkness energies out there and kind of or dark metal and kind of bring it, show it around with Dark Dragonite. Very, very powerful because you can have the likes of Rocket's Sneasel EX, which can deal 30 plus 10 more for each dark Pokemon you have in play. Very, very powerful with there because of the likes of darkness energy. Your attacks do 10 more damage. So dealing more damage in there is incredibly powerful. And obviously the likes of double dark energy plus darkness energy, you're immediately attacking very, very easily in this sort of game. I absolutely find this deck is absolutely fascinating because you've really focused on having these Dragonite and Electrode to have their setup, and then having these big one-hit KO potential, or even just a slow sort of effects with Sneasel. Cypher is another additionally good attack, where as long as Cypher EX, you're not really using its ability, but have some decent sort of things where you can have Slashing Blow and Bounce. We get to switch your opponent with any of your Pokemon you have in play. Solrock and Lunatone are one of these very interesting archetypes, which are kind of like played as support in loads of other decks. Solrock has the Lunar Shade, which as long as you have a Lunatone in play, each player's colorless Pokemon have no Poke Power. Kind of like slowing down Pidgeot as much as possible. And the Lunatone has, as long as you Solrock in play, each player's fire Pokemon can't use any of the Poke Power to shut down the likes of LudiCargo and Houndoom. Very interesting sort of decks around here as well. And those are the other Rocket archetypes really help with the searching aspect and in the general playability. Another sort of finishing up the top 8. This unfortunately wasn't the top 8 Ludicolo list, but I thought I'd kind of like showcase you exactly what this Ludicolo deck really looked like. It was definitely interesting because you have the likes of Ludicolo. Ludicolo is very interesting because it has the likes of its Poke Power, which is during your turn, you may draw a card and pretty much just having a draw effect, but have the healing steps where you get to start as many cards you like from your hand because you're searching lots of drawings of factor with her, and you get to heal as many cards that you discard. Now, why is this swing dance really powerful? Well, if we team it up with the Smooth Over Macaca, you get to search your deck for a card, shuffle your deck, and put it on top of your deck. Then you use Ludicolo to draw into it. Absolutely fascinating, really, really powerful. You're constantly trying to get these big one-hit KOs and getting your draw set up as much as possible. Then you have the circular steps, which for a water and double colorless, that's 10 damage for the number of Pokemon you have in play, both yours and your opponent's. Think of it like Jump plus Mass Attack. Back then, that was only one energy attached, and that was only released a couple years later. So it's interesting to already see the power dynamic and the big shift in change. Scramble energy is definitely very powerful. Think of it exactly like reversal energy is what we have in the format right now, which is pretty much, if you're behind in prices, it is three energies. I really like this. Very, very fascinating, very, very interesting archetype. Kind of what I would touch on it, but much more slower in this sort of very exciting and kind of a bit slow, but even slower sort of format. So why do people love this format so much? I kind of looked into it, and a lot of people like it because there are these dual Pokemon types. There are so many different decks to choose from. I know I mentioned that a lot, but if you think about the format we've had pretty much since COVID's returned, it's been focusing on only 3 incredibly powerful archetypes and nothing really from then onwards. So that's why I always like to see exactly and talk to you about why there are so many interesting archetypes in this sort of meta. There's also multiple game different mechanics. You have obviously the EXs, which is very, very powerful and really strong. And Pokemon love it so much. We're on our 3rd different iteration of an EX card. There are obviously the Holon engine. There's obviously the Delta species. So there's so many archetypes in here, which really add to the long game sort of mechanics in this sort of format. That's why I absolutely find it fascinating, because if we just look at some of these key cards here, you can understand exactly why. You have the Jirachi's Wishing Star, which lets you just pretty much look at the top 5 cards and choose one and put them in your hand. Obviously, if it is, obviously it's now asleep. So think of it like Stellar Wish back in the day. Obviously, there were a load of the Gen 3 cards which kind of had like reprints, pseudo reprints in that sort of era. And the Jirachi was definitely one of them. Solrock, like I just mentioned now, if you have a low turn in play, there's no Poke Powers in play. You have the Mew EX with the Poke Body and Versatile, which can use any of your opponents, all Pokemon in play as its own, but you have to have the necessary energy requirements. Mew has constantly had this one from pretty much day one, and it's got to be a staple from here on out. And this is the Electrode as well. Here, the bomb tar sort of aspect on this sort of attribution for it. We get to discard Electrode EX, very similar. It counts as knocking it out. If you do search your discard pile for 5 energies and attach them to your Pokemon in any way you like, excluding Electrode EX. So this is good because obviously you could attach special energy because it just kind of like mentioned just energy cards. And if we then look at some really key supporter cards here, we can see Rocket's Admin, which is basically N. Everyone shuffles a hand of deck and draw the amount of prize cards they have left. Celio's Network, which is search your deck for a basic Pokemon or evolved Pokemon and show it to your opponent's hand. And Scott, which is search your deck for 3 combination of supporters or stadium cards and show them to your opponent. Very, very interesting. You can kind of see here, a bit slow with Celio and Scott, like using your supporter return to kind of get that. But there weren't the likes of Ultra Ball, Quick Ball, Nest Ball, all these different like balls and Poker Communication, these big unique search cards as items, which we're constantly used to. And then the Battle Frontier here, which is a way to kind of really slow down Pidgeot sort of engines, as well as the likes of Dragonites and, well, both ones, and when like that. So I hope this has kind of been a helpful sort of introduction to exactly what the Worlds 2006 was. I think it's definitely a fascinating format, and definitely one I really want to hope to explore. This is one of the kind of like just like the 3rd time Pokemon really introduced the World sort of series, and having loads of different archetypes like the Delta species as well as in the Holon mechanic was definitely something which has been kind of like a key staple, which people have grown absolutely really fond memories with. I as well definitely am one of those sort of cases. If you have enjoyed this video, please make sure to like and subscribe, and don't forget to join the channel if you have. It absolutely means a lot and really helps out to know exactly what content you guys like to do, and you get to see some exclusive stuff as well. I will be back obviously next Thursday with a different sort of retro take and in a couple of days time for a new video. See you guys then. Bye for now.